This is the second session in our study on the books of Joshua and Judges. In this session, we're going to continue to look back at the Torah, or Pentateuch, that precedes the book of Joshua in our Old Testament Bibles. We're going to read a passage from Numbers and then another one from Deuteronomy before we read and discuss the first two chapters of Joshua. We'll talk more about the Deuteronomist and some theories about the use of literary technique in the writing of Deuteronomy that may have carried over into Joshua and Judges. But first we begin with a prayer. Oh God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. In session 1, we used the Genesis creation stories as an example of the multiple source writing format used in the Torah as well as in much of the rest of the Old Testament. We will see evidence of at least two distinct sources when we read Joshua. Modern scholars have identified 4 different primary sources being utilized in the Torah. They are labeled J, E, P, and D. We also discussed how God led Abraham to the promised land in Canaan, but that famine drove Abraham's descendants into Egypt, where they ultimately became slaves. In the book of Exodus, God called on Moses to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. Late in that book, Moses is given the 10 Commandments written on some stone tablets. The tablets are placed inside the Ark of the Covenant. The book of Exodus ends with the building of the tabernacle as a shelter for the ark. The third book of the Torah, Leviticus, dwells chiefly on matters of ritual and law, not many stories. In other contexts, Leviticus includes some important details about the origin of Hebrew law, but we're not going to discuss it at this point. There is a good deal more narrative in the book of Numbers, so we're going to look at one of the stories from Numbers here. The people of Israel are still in the wilderness and appear ready to go forward into the land of Canaan. I'm going to read here from chapters 13 and 14. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each of their ancestral tribes you shall send a man, every one a leader among them." So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran. Moses sent them out to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, "Go up there into the Negeb and go up into the hill country and see what the land is like and whether the people who live in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, and whether the land they live in is good or bad, and whether the towns that they live in are unwalled or fortified, and whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not." So they went up and spied out the land. At the end of the 40 days, they returned from spying out the land, and they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the Israelites in the wilderness of Paran. "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey. Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified and very large, and besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there." But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Then the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against this people, for they are stronger than we." So they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great size. There we saw Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." And Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. And they said to the congregations of the people of Israel, "The land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us." So, after Moses sent spies into Canaan, he got mixed reviews. Caleb and Joshua said to go for it, while the other 10 spies were afraid and said, we seemed like grasshoppers to them. And they didn't cross over the Jordan River. The book of Numbers includes some more laws and roll call or census of the 12 tribes. There was some combat with kingdoms on the east side of the Jordan. Moses' sister and brother, Miriam and Aaron, die, and Moses' impending death is announced by God. There is a good deal of poetry in the book of Numbers, yet in the end, they still have not crossed over the Jordan into the promised land. Numbers is followed by Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Torah. The book of Deuteronomy is presented as Moses' valedictory address, in which he delivers across the Jordan from the promised land just before his death. The people assembled before him are poised to cross over the river into the land. Moses tells much of the story that was previously told in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. In chapter 4 of Deuteronomy, Moses tells of God giving Israel the 10 Commandments at Mount Horeb. How you once stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, where the Lord said to me, assemble the people for me, and I will let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me as long as they live on earth, and may teach their children. So you approached and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain was blazing up to the very heavens, shrouded in dark clouds. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. He declared to you his covenant, which he charged you to observe, that is, the 10 Commandments, and he wrote them on 2 stone tablets. In the 19th century, scholars who looked at the literary context of Joshua often looked at Joshua as the completion of the Pentateuch. That is, they visualized a hexateuch, which included Joshua along with the 5 books of Moses as a single unit. In the early 20th century, there was a movement toward interpreting Joshua as history, and archaeological findings seemed to confirm the stories of Joshua, and the focus was on recovering the history of tribal Israel. Late in the 20th century, the historical models began to break down as newer archaeological methods suggested that cities such as the walled Jericho were destroyed several hundred years before the time of Joshua. Research on the cultural history of Syria-Palestine further underscored the non-historical character of the story of conquest. Emphasis again shifted to literary analysis, and it was suggested that the Deuteronomist was the author not just of Deuteronomy, but also of Joshua. The Deuteronomist is hypothesized to have written, or at least edited, the books of Deuteronomy apart from the other 4 books of the Torah. The theory is that J, E, and P were the primary sources for the first 4 books, and D, the Deuteronomist, is the primary source for Deuteronomy. Yet, the theory tells us that the Deuteronomist also redacted, that is, compiled, edited, revised, and added materials to the other 6 books of the Deuteronomistic History: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. We're going to look at an example of the thought process behind the hypothesis of the Deuteronomist. Specifically, we are going to look at the composition of the book of Deuteronomy. There are only 3 characters who speak in Deuteronomy: God, Moses, and the narrator. The immediate hero of the book is Moses, as the spokesman of God. The only other person who is quoted by the narrator is God. Thus, there are only 2 direct voices which the narrator asks us to listen to in the book: Moses' voice and God's. Deuteronomy may be described, therefore, as the speech of the Deuteronomic narrator, in which he directly quotes only 2 figures in the story, predominantly Moses and sometimes God. One of the immediate results of this exceedingly complex network of speeches within speeches is the deliberate representation in Deuteronomy of a vast number of intersecting statements. sometimes in agreement with one another and sometimes interfering with one another. This enables the book to be a repository of several viewpoints, all working together to achieve an effect on the reader that is multidimensional. So we first ask, how reliable a narrator do we have here? And how is his voice related to the voice of the book's implied author? The narrator alone can tell us what Moses says, that God says to the reader of the book. The reporting context of Deuteronomy, that is, the narration, makes up only about 56 verses. The remainder of the book is composed of utterances of various individuals, mostly Moses, reported in direct discourse. The most obvious functions of the narrator's words are that they put the words of Moses in time and space, and that they define the preeminent position of Moses held as leader and legislator of his people, and Moses himself as the greatest prophet in Israel's history. So the text occasionally abruptly shifts from Moses' words to the narrator's comments and back again. Usually explanatory background information. Phrases include, even to this day. These breaks may allow the author-editor to involve his readers more in his message. The narrator is subtly reinforcing the difference between Moses' audience and his own audience, the readers of the book, so they may be kept subtly aware of the distance. The author, through his narrator, becomes the Moses of his generation. I'm going to say that again, so write this down. The author, through his narrator, becomes the Moses of his generation. As our example, we're going to look at the second address of Moses. This is from chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, first verse through 28, verse 68. We're not going to read all that, just a few verses. The core of this address is the so-called Deuteronomic Law Code, which goes from chapter 12:1 through 26:15. Phraseological, psychological, and temporal composition have an important bearing on our understanding of the ideological composition of the book, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. The most basic point of view of the work is the ideological or evaluative. The phraseological plane appears to be exactly the same or very similar to the plane of expression. The spatio-temporal plane involves the location in time and space from whose perspective an author, narrator, or character speaks in a work. The author-narrator here is assumed to have lived several hundred years after the death of Moses. The composition of a work on one plane may or may not be consistent with its composition on another. We're going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 5, in which Moses refers to the 10 Commandments given Israel at Mount Horeb. It's important to remember that after hearing the voice of God speak the words of the 10 Commandments, the people fear that they cannot hear more and still live. God agrees with this position and commands Moses to teach the people all the commandments, statutes, and ordinances he will tell him. The law code is precisely a report of Moses' teaching the people of what God told him. Moses did in fact not die, as they thought they would, had they heard the words of God which he had heard. So we're going to read from chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. Moses convened all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances that I am addressing to you. Today you shall learn them and observe them diligently. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us, who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain out of the fire. At that time I was standing between the Lord and you to declare to you the word of the Lord. For you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up to the mountain." And he said, and Moses goes on, There's a clear phraseological alternation in Moses' utterances here between the I versus you in form in verses 1, 4, and 5, and the our versus us form in verses 2 and 3. One might well ask whether a shift is thereby indicated on other surface planes as well. Also, do these surface shifts involve an ideological shift as well? Moses is described as framing the reported words of God by means of his reporting words of chapter 5, verse 1 through 11:32 and 26:16 through 28:68. God is only quoted in direct discourse 9 times in 24 chapters. These few direct utterances seem to have an important function. One can analyze the speech of a character of a work in the same way one analyzes the speech of an author or a narrator of a work. We can see the overall composition of Deuteronomy is one in which we read how Moses is described as declaring and interpreting the Word of God as a panoramic preview of how the Deuteronomic narrator will describe and interpret the word of Moses in Joshua through 2 Kings. The law code, that is from chapter 12 through 26, predominantly employs phrases such as your God versus our God, which is used only once. Moses uses the our form 11 times in the first address. This is an indication of the psychological shift between the two addresses. He speaks as a fellow Israelite in the first address, but from the viewpoint of his role as a teacher in the second address. All Israelites heard the voice of God giving the 10 words, but only Moses, at the elder's request and God's command, hears God's further words to be reported to the rest of the people. This is the main psychological viewpoint of the second address. The second address is predominantly future-oriented, just as the first address was predominantly past-oriented. Let's talk about the ideological differences. In the first address, the Deuteronomic voice tends to emphasize the uniqueness of Moses or Israel, and also tends to emphasize hope through the grace and mercy of God. The utterances that appear to diminish Moses or Israel's unique status tend to emphasize law and God's retributive justice. Then the second address, which is full of words or speech that exalt and emphasize Moses and Israel's unique statuses. These lead to the idea that there will never be another prophet like Moses, and no nation has enjoyed such a special status as the Lord in Israel. All this is in the context of God's retributive justice and covenant of law with Israel. This tends to contradict the tentative conclusions we reached in analysis of the first address. The Mosaic Law Code is the authenticating words of God that form the basis for this unique teaching role Moses enjoys in the book of Deuteronomy. The utterances show the unique status of Moses and Israel. However, a direct challenge to Moses' unique status as teacher of Israel is launched directly at the source of Moses' central role in the book. The authenticating words of God in 5:28 through 31 say, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren. Moses would then no longer be unique. I know that's a lot to digest. A few major points here. We have a narrator or author who is quoting and interpreting Moses, who is quoting and interpreting God. So we have an opportunity for 3 different viewpoints all at once. There's a difference between Moses' audience and the audience of the narrator or author. Third, Moses' speech tends to separate himself from the people by his use of your God in later chapters instead of our God that he uses in the earlier chapters. Number 4, the narrator author subtly takes on the role of prophet. As Moses teaches the group of Israelites before him, the narrator teaches the group that is reading his book. With all that background, We're going to go to the book of Joshua, chapter 1. Joshua 1 provides the prologue to the book of Joshua. It establishes two related themes that are central to the story: the divine promise of land as a place of rest for Israel and the commission of Joshua to achieve that goal. Verse 1, chapter 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, "My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, and all the land of the Hittites to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you in all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall lead this people to possess the land that I swore to their ancestors to give to them. Only be strong and very courageous, and being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. I hereby command you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." The Hebrew term used in verses 2 and 4 is zeh. God is addressing Joshua from across the Jordan River from Canaan. So he uses the zeh to mean this people, this Jordan, and this Lebanon. This Jordan across which Joshua will have to lead the people. This people whom Joshua must lead, and this Lebanon, which marks the northern limits of the land. The boundaries are utopian or even fantastic, borders which Israel never occupied. Verse 8 refers to this book of law, or in some translations, this book of teaching. Most certainly it refers to Deuteronomy. But notice the tension here. Verses 2 through 6 speak of Israel's rest in the land and the success of Joshua's leadership as being an unconditional divine pledge based on past oath to the ancestors. But in the next verse, we find there are conditions. Verse 7, only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. First, an unconditional promise, and then the claim that success is based on following the law of Moses. These are both key players in this narrative. We go to verse 10. Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, "Pass through the camp and command the people, prepare your provisions, for in 3 days you are to cross over this Jordan to go to take possession of the land that the Lord your God gives you to possess." But the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, "Remember the word that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord your God is providing you a place of rest and will give you this land. Your wives, your little ones, and your livestock shall remain in the land that Moses gave you beyond the Jordan. But all the warriors among you shall cross over, armed before your kindred, and shall help them, until the Lord gives rest to your kindred as well as to you, and they also take possession of the land that the Lord God is giving them. Then you shall return to your own land and take possession of it, the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan to the east." This passage talks about 2.5 tribes that chose to settle on land to the east of the Jordan. So we go on. They answered Joshua, "All that you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with us as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your orders and disobeys your words, whatever your command shall be, put to death. Only be strong and courageous." Of course, the Israelites, in fact, were repeatedly rebellious against Moses, but it's best to look at this unswerving statement of loyalty as an idealized representation. It is not supposed to be intended as just irony. Thomas Bozeman suggests that the original introduction was written as a prologue, as an independent book of Joshua, not as part of the Deuteronomic history. He suggests that the original prologue included the unconditional promise of land to the ancestors, that is Joshua 1, 1b to 2, 5 to 6, 10 to 18. We'll look at this first part of that again. The Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, "My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, and you and all this people into the land that I am giving to them, to the Israelites. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall lead this people to possess the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them." Then Joshua commanded, this is in verse 10, then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, "Pass through the camp and command the people. Prepare your provisions, for in 3 days you are to cross over the Jordan to go and take possession of the land that the Lord God gives you to possess." Bozeman's theory was that a later addition included an additional demand for obedience to the law, that is, the Deuteronomic law. Verses 3 through 4, 7 through 9, 13, chapter 13, 2 through 6, and chapter 23, 1 through 6. So I'll read part of that again, just a little bit. Beginning with verse 3 in chapter 1. "Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness of the Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. Only be strong and be very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. I hereby command you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." So Bozeman suggests that this second section was added at a later date than the first prologue we read earlier. Let's go on to chapter 2 and reread "Remember the spy stories" that we read a few minutes ago from Numbers. Chapter 2, verse 1. "Then Joshua, son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, 'Go view the land, especially Jericho.' So they went and entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and spent the night there. The king of Jericho was told, 'Some Israelites have come here tonight to search out the land.' Then the king of Jericho sent orders to Rahab, 'Bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out the whole land.' But the woman took the 2 men and hid them. Then she said, 'True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they came from. And when it was time to close the gate at dark, the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you can overtake them.' She had, however, brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. So the men pursued them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords. As soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut." The 2 spies remind us of the 2 spies in Numbers, Caleb and Joshua, who did not come back with a fearful report like their 10 companions. The story is framed as a pointed reversal of the earlier failed spy mission. In verse 3, we are told that the spies were charged with seeing the whole land in Jericho. Jericho was a city-state and would have governed the surrounding territory, so not just that within its walls, but larger area. The stalks of flax where the spies would have hidden would have been laid out on the roof to dry. Go to verse 8. Before they went to sleep, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that dread of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and to Og, whom you utterly destroyed. As soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no courage left in any of us because of you. The Lord your God is indeed God in heaven above and on earth below. Now then, since I have dealt kindly with you, swear to me that the Lord, that you in turn will deal kindly with my family. Give me a sign of good faith, that you will spare my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. The men said to her, Our life for yours. If you do not tell this business of ours, then we will deal kindly and faithfully with you when the Lord gives us the land. In saying all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before you, Rahab is directly quoting the Song of the Sea from Exodus 15. Rahab is cast as a good monotheist, persuaded by the Lord's supreme sovereignty. We go on to verse 15. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the outer side of the city wall, and she resided within the wall itself. She said to them, Go toward the hill country, so that the pursuers may not come upon you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Then afterward you may go your way. The men said to her, We will be released from this oath that you have made us swear to you. If we invade the land, and you do not tie the crimson cord in the window through which you let us down, and you do not gather into your house your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family. If any of you go out of the doors of your house into the street, they shall be responsible for their own death, and we shall be innocent. But if a hand is laid upon any of who are with you, the house which we shall bear responsibility for their death. But if you tell this business of ours, then we shall be released from this oath that you made us swear to you. She said, According to your words, so be it. And she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the crimson cord in the window. Since Rahab's house was on an outer wall of the city, lowering them by rope from her windows enables them to get out of the city even though the gate is locked. She tells them to go to the mountain area to the west of the Jordan Valley, in the opposite direction from the one taken by their pursuers. The terrain would have also provided good hiding places. So we go on to verse 22. They departed and went into the hill country and stayed there 3 days until the pursuers returned. The pursuers had searched all along the way and found nothing. Then the 2 men came down from the hill country. They crossed over, came to Joshua, son of Nun, and told him all that had happened to them. Then they said to Joshua, Truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands. Moreover, the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before us. There are a number of theories about the authorship of this spies and Rahab story. It appears to be a later edition. It seems to split the prologue in chapter 1 and the actual crossing of the Jordan, which begins in chapter 3, where nothing is said about the spies. Some scholars consider chapter 2 to be a continuation of the spy stories we read in Numbers 13 and 14. The setting of Shittim in the first verse of the story suggests the source was E. The source generally assumed to have written Numbers 25, verse 1, where the Israelites are also located at Shittim. In session 3, we'll read Joshua 3 through 7 and discuss an alternative commentary that looks at Joshua Judges as historical. I hope you can join us for our discussion session Monday evening. Send an email to onlineclasses@northgateumc.org to get the Zoom link. Have a good week.